The Galactic Council chamber was silent, a rare occurrence in a place where politics and war often bred chaos. Representatives from dozens of species, each adorned in the regalia of their home worlds, watched as Admiral Valen of the Zolari stood before them. His species, known for their crystalline exoskeletons and cold logic, rarely displayed emotion, but even he could not mask his unease. "The battle at Zynar Prime is lost," Valen admitted, his voice sharp and clipped. "We sacrificed 3 fleets, billions of soldiers, and gained nothing." He turned, scanning the room. "The Vorn Dominion marches forward. Soon they will reach the core worlds." A murmur spread through the chamber, filled with the hisses, clicks, and guttural sounds of different species reacting in dismay. The Vorn Dominion had never been stopped. A predatory race with unparalleled military efficiency, they swept through the galaxy like a plague, leaving only subjugation or extinction in their wake. Every strategy, every weapon, every desperate attempt to halt their advance had failed. High Chancellor Orlax, a towering being with deep-set eyes and a voice like grinding stone, finally spoke. "We must consider alternatives." A delicate, almost frail figure stepped forward. The human diplomat, Ambassador Helen Carter, was one of the last representatives of her people in the Council. Humanity had once held a formidable presence in galactic affairs, but their decline had been as rapid as their rise. A century of internal conflicts, dwindling populations, and self-imposed isolation had left them little more than an afterthought in the grand theater of war. Yet now, Carter's voice did not waver. "There is still a force we have not called upon," she said. "The soldiers of Earth." A scoff came from a reptilian warlord. "Earth's armies are a shadow of what they once were. Your people barely contribute forces to the Council. What warriors could you possibly offer?" Carter's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Not new soldiers," she said. "Old ones." Silence. Then laughter, low and incredulous. Valen tilted his head. "You propose sending your elderly into war? Are you suggesting we line them up as sacrifices?" Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "These are not just old men and women. They're the veterans of the last great wars, fighters who battled before your drones, before your AI-commanded fleets, before strategy was dictated by machines instead of instincts." Her gaze swept across the council members. "They are soldiers who fought when death was certain and victory was earned through grit, not calculations." The chamber remained still. The notion was absurd. War was no longer fought with mere experience. It was fought with technology, precision, and cybernetically enhanced troops. What could humans, aging and frail, possibly bring to a war against a Vorn? "The Council has already dismissed humanity's relevance," Valen said. "Even if we accepted this proposal, there is no guarantee these so-called veterans would make a difference." "No guarantees," Carter admitted. "Only the chance that they will fight harder than any force you've ever seen." A long pause. Then Orlax let out a low rumble. Desperation breeds strange allies. The vote was cast. By a narrow margin, the council agreed. The call for old soldiers was sent. The arrival of Earth's forces was met with barely concealed skepticism. The first transport ships landed on the war-torn moon of Ardentis III, a crucial stronghold near the front lines. Council officers and young alien recruits gathered to witness the spectacle, expecting frail, hollow-eyed relics of a bygone era. Instead, what they saw unsettled them. The humans who disembarked were old, yes, but not weak. They carried themselves with a presence, an air of hardened experience that turned initial snickers into uneasy silence. Scars ran deep on their skin, and the way they moved spoke of battles that had left marks far beyond the physical. Among them was Colonel Elias Grant, his graying hair cropped close, his weathered face unreadable. He had fought wars before humanity retreated from the stars, before the Council believed Earth had nothing left to give. A young alien officer, barely past his first decade of service, approached Grant with uncertainty. "You are the reinforcements?" Grant glanced around at his fellow soldiers, then back at the officer. "That's right." The officer hesitated. "But you're old." Grant smirked. "Son, I've been old for years. Still breathing, though, and I know more ways to kill an enemy than you do." Skepticism turned to silent observation as the veterans set to work. They didn't wait for instructions or elaborate simulations. They studied the battlefield with a keen eye, discussing tactics with a casualness that unsettled their younger counterparts. These were men and women who had seen war before it became a contest of statistics. They spoke of terrain advantages, of enemy psychology, of ambush strategies that had been abandoned in favor of cold, logical, AI-driven combat. The real test came soon. A Vorn raiding force, unaware of the new arrivals, attacked the moon's outer defenses. Council soldiers prepared for a traditional engagement, calculate optimal firing angles, deploy drone squadrons, let the AI predict enemy maneuvers. The veterans did none of that. Instead, they acted. They took to the battlefield without hesitation, moving with a precision that came from years of real combat. They ignored predictive AI warnings, trusting their instincts over mathematical projections. They laid traps, used the environment, anticipated the enemy's reactions in ways no algorithm could. And they won. The battle was not just a victory. It was a lesson. The Vorn retreated, confused and rattled. Their predictable advances turned into vulnerabilities. The council officers, who had watched from command centers, were left stunned. For the first time in years, they had not just held the line. They had outmaneuvered the enemy. The Galactic Council had expected human veterans to be a liability. Instead, they had become something else entirely. The first crack in the Vorn's invincibility had appeared. The battlefield was chaos. Smoke and fire twisted in the air, the stench of charred metal and flesh mingling into something acrid and unnatural. The Vorn had struck harder than expected, their forces descending upon Artemis III with the cold, methodical brutality they were infamous for. The younger council soldiers scrambled to maintain formation, relying on their exosuits' targeting systems and AI-assisted commands to dictate their movements. It wasn't enough. The enemy adapted too quickly, exploiting the gaps between calculations, turning predictive combat into a liability. Then the old soldiers moved. Colonel Elias Grant led the charge, his body slower than it once had been, but his instincts razor-sharp. He had fought wars long before the Vorn were even a known threat, and he knew that technology meant nothing if a soldier didn't trust their gut. He ignored the AI projections screaming at him to hold position, and instead signaled a flank maneuver, his voice cutting to the comms with the clarity of a man who had given orders under fire 1,000 times before. Form up, cut off their retreat route. The younger officers hesitated, their battle strategies dictated by pre-planned simulations that didn't account for unpredictability. But the veterans didn't hesitate. They surged forward, using cover with an efficiency that came from decades of hard-earned experience. They set up crossfires without needing orders, anticipated enemy movements before they happened, and exploited weaknesses that no algorithm could detect. One of the Vorn commanders, a towering creature encased in segmented battleplate, saw the shift too late. What had been a calculated slaughter turned into something else, an ambush they had not foreseen. Suddenly, the humans were inside their ranks, too close for their long-range weapons to be effective. They used guerrilla tactics, short bursts of concentrated fire, and brutal hand-to-hand combat to tear through the enemy's lines. Elias drove his combat knife into the exposed joint of a Vorn warrior's armor, twisting until the alien gurgled and collapsed. He didn't pause to celebrate. Instead, he kicked a fallen plasma rifle into the hands of Sergeant Valdez, who caught it mid-roll and fired a shot clean to another Vorn's visor. "Didn't think I'd be doing this at my age," Valdez muttered, breathless but grinning. Elias wiped blood from his face, eyes scanning the battlefield. Not bad for a bunch of old men, huh? The tide turned. What had started as another grim loss for the Council became an overwhelming rout. The Vorn, unused to opponents who fought outside of predictable patterns, faltered. Their formations crumbled. Panic spread through their ranks, their commanders unable to process how these aging humans, these relics, had shattered their offensive. And the humans didn't stop there. After securing Artemis III, the veteran proposed something radical, to take the fight directly to the Vorn. The younger officers balked at the idea. The Council had spent years fighting defensively, retreating when necessary, choosing survival over direct confrontation. But the veterans had fought wars when retreat wasn't an option. They knew that an enemy like the Vorn wouldn't stop unless they were given a reason to fear. The Council hesitated, but the victory on Artemis III had changed the conversation. Humanity's old warriors had proven themselves, and for the first time in years, the galaxy had hope. So they took Cora 5. Cora 5 was a strategic Vorn outpost, heavily fortified and considered impenetrable. The Council's younger commanders estimated that a direct assault would take months, possibly years, and cost millions of lives. The veterans disagreed. "You're thinking like machines," Elias told them during the War Council. "You want to attack it head-on, break through their defenses in a way they expect. That's why you keep losing." A Zalari tactician who had relied on AI-assisted combat his entire career frowned. "And you suggest?" Elias leaned forward. "We don't fight like you. We don't fight like them. We fight like us." The plan was madness, and yet it worked. Instead of prolonged siege, the veterans infiltrated Cora 5 using outdated methods of Vorn had long stopped preparing for: low-tech insertion, silent strikes, old-school sabotage. They disabled the outpost defenses before the main fleet even arrived. By the time the bulk of the Council's forces launched their assault, the Vorn were already compromised. The battle was over in hours. Victory. The Council forces stood in stunned silence as the last Vorn bodies fell. Cora 5 had been an unbreakable fortress, and yet the humans, these forgotten soldiers, had taken it in a single night. Word spread. For the first time in the war, the Vorn Dominion hesitated. They had conquered countless worlds, broken entire civilizations, but they had never encountered an enemy like this. An enemy that did not fight by the rules. An enemy that should have been weak, but had proven to be more dangerous than any enhanced soldier or advanced AI. The Galactic Council took notice, too. The skepticism that had met the old soldiers upon their arrival was gone, replaced with something far closer to awe. But the veterans did not celebrate. They had fought too many wars to mistake a battle for the end. Elias stood on the war-torn plains of Cora 5, watching the Council forces secure their hard-won victory. Valdez approached, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "They're looking at us differently now," Valdez said, "like they finally get it." Elias exhaled, rubbing his aching joints. "They don't get it yet, but they will, because the war wasn't over." And the Vorn would not take this defeat lightly. The Vorn did not retreat quietly. Humiliated by their first true defeat in decades, they responded with ferocity that sent ripples of fear through the galaxy. No longer content with methodical conquest, they unleashed devastation. Planets burned under orbital bombardments. Entire populations were wiped out in acts of pure vengeance. The Council scrambled to mount defenses, but it was clear the rules of war had changed. This was no longer a campaign of expansion for the Vorn. It was extermination. Elias Grant watched the reports in silence. Every world lost, every slaughtered colony, was a reminder that victory at Cora 5 had not ended anything. If anything, it had made the war bloodier. The Vorn now saw humanity's old soldiers not as relics, but as a threat. And when the Vorn felt threatened, they eradicated the problem. "They're hunting us," Valdez muttered beside him, scanning the casualty lists. "Targeting human settlements. Our families." Elias clenched his fists. He had spent his life fighting wars, and for the first time, he questioned if it had been worth it. They had proven that experience mattered, that age did not mean weakness, but in doing so, they had painted a target on their backs. The Council had accepted them, but acceptance did not mean protection. If humanity was going to survive this war, it would have to save itself. And so they did. The old soldiers led the charge, but this time they weren't alone. Younger humans, inspired by the impossible victories their elders had won, enlisted by the thousands. The old ways of war, the instincts and tactics that had nearly been forgotten, were passed down in brutal training regimens. Veterans who fought in the trenches of Earth's long-dead wars now stood side by side with fresh recruits, drilling them in a kind of warfare the Vorn could never predict. The next battle was different. On the industrial world of Onyx 7, where the Vorn had established their largest forward base, humanity struck back, not with overwhelming numbers, not with superior firepower, but with sheer, unrelenting tenacity. The veterans led infiltration teams deep into enemy territory, sabotaging supply lines and crippling command structures before the main assault even began. The younger soldiers, hardened by training that demanded adaptability over rigid tactics, moved like ghosts through the battlefield. The Vorn fought back, their sheer strength and brutal efficiency nearly overwhelming the offensive. But for the first time, they faced an enemy that did not break. Elias himself led the final push. Despite the pain that ached his bones, despite the exhaustion that weighed down his limbs, he had given everything to this war, and he would see it through. His squad moved through the shattered ruins of an old factory, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat. Plasma fire seared past him, the scent of burning metal thick in the air. Valdez was beside him, taking down an enemy with practiced precision, grinning through bloody teeth. "We're winning," Valdez panted, pressing his back against a rusted support beam. Elias didn't answer. He looked around, at the bodies of his men and the enemy alike, at the destruction that had become too familiar. Winning. The word felt hollow. Then the final order came. The Vorn were retreating. The war wasn't over, but its outcome had shifted. The unthinkable had happened. The Vorn had lost their momentum. When the smoke cleared, the Council forces stood victorious on Onyx 7. The Vorn presence had been eradicated. What was once an unstoppable force was now faltering. And at the heart of it all, the old soldiers stood, their war-worn faces unreadable. The Galactic Council, once so skeptical, now viewed them with something akin to reverence. For the first time, humanity was not seen as a fading empire, but as something else entirely, something the galaxy had underestimated. Elias stood before the Council once more, his uniform stained with battle. Orlax, the High Chancellor, regarded him with a measured expression. "You have done the impossible," Orlax said. "You have changed the course of this war." Elias exhaled slowly. "It's not over yet." "No," Orlax admitted, "but it will be. And when it is, humanity will no longer be forgotten." There was no grand celebration, no fanfare. The veterans knew better than to believe in endings. They had fought too many wars to expect peace to last. But they had done what no one thought possible. They had reminded the galaxy that strength was not just in numbers or technology. It was in experience, in resilience, in the will to fight even when the odds were impossible. The war would continue, but humanity had secured its place once more, not as an afterthought, not as a dying race, but as warriors.